special interest group within the Institute, which focuses on behavioral insights and the application of behavioral sciences to public relations practice. We're working with LSE, long connections with LSE, but especially glad to have this connection now. We agreed in the summer that we would collaborate on a series of webinars which would look at this topic, the application of behavioral science principles to combating the problems arising out of climate change. We've also talked about further seminars which will deal with public health questions, and the third one which will look at the questions of disinformation and misinformation. But tonight's session is a follow-on to COP26, which of course was given a lot of attention over the past few weeks, the outcome of that meeting. We wanted to follow that on with this discussion tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the webinar as the leader of the discussion on this topic, Moira Nicholson. Moira is a behavioral scientist in the Cabinet Office's Behavioral Sciences team and an honorary research fellow at University College London. She's an expert on this topic of application of behavioral sciences to questions of energy management and the problems arising from climate change. She's worked with a number of clients across the energy industry, and is now with the Cabinet Office. She's also been in the past a member of the Behavioural Insights team, the so-called nudge unit. I'm going to hand over to Moira now and thank her very much for leading this discussion. She'll be talking about the application of behavioral science principles to questions of combating climate change. Moira, if I could hand over to you, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and hi everybody. It's nice to, if not see you all, to know you're all there, and I'm really pleased to be speaking today. So what I was wanting to talk to you all about is why it's important to build self-belief amongst the public and a green public identity in order to tackle the challenges posed by climate change. So essentially, there's always been a bit of a debate over exactly what role climate and behavioural change actually has to play in climate change mitigation. And sort of my short explanation for why it's so important is that unfortunately, the kind of theory of how we get from our current system to a net zero one, unfortunately doesn't stop at the decarbonisation of our energy supply. So yes, we now have a lot more renewables in our energy system than we did before. I think it's now something like 40% of our electricity is generated from renewable sources, and has been growing over the last decades. But just simply decarbonising our supply doesn't get us to where we need to be, and that is because the appliances that we use and run in our homes and outside of our homes are mostly appliances that run on fossil fuels. So big ones being our cars that run on petrol, and in our homes, our heating, gas boilers. So until those are all replaced, and mostly this is our individual decisions to make those replacements, we won't actually be able to take that renewable energy and displace the fossil fuels that are causing so much of the problem. So even though there is somewhat, an acceptance that behaviour changes is going to form a part of the strategy, there's still a lot of, skepticism over exactly what role that will take. And so this is an example of that exact type of thing, where you see a lot of articles and discussion over exactly how useful individual behavioural actions are to fight climate change. So here's an article published in The Atlantic talking about actually how useful is recycling, and then talking about, among all the possible things we can do to help the planet, recycling ranks pretty low. And of course, you see a lot of other discussions about, well, how useful is it for us to stay off red meat if the bananas we're buying are being flown, you know, hundreds of miles in planes. You know, what's actually better for the environment? Is it actually better to eat, you know, local red meat than it is to eat fruit that's been flown in? And so you see a lot of this kind of discussion over actually how useful are the things that we can do. And then this is an article from The Guardian a number of years ago now. It's quite old, this one, but I think it's quite sort of emblematic of the type of articles that you do see. So this is an article talking about how, you know, just 100 companies are responsible for, you know, the lion's share of our emissions. And actually, when you look at the list, it's not no surprise, it's all the fossil fuel producers, you know, likes of Shell, BP. So in a sense, it's sort of, I would say, kind of tautological to talk about these companies, you know, causing the lion's share of emissions, because of course they are fossil fuel producers. And the kind of subtext to this kind of article is, well, if these companies are causing the lion's share of the problem, then how useful is it for us to, you know, I don't know, turn our lights down when we're out of the room, or recycle? And even amongst organisations that do kind of see a big role for individual action in fighting climate change, this is a poster from, some of you might recognise it, Extinction Rebellion. There's still sort of this general sense of, you know, act now, here it is, act now because it's too late. So it's obviously a very playful poster. It's very attention grabbing because it plays on that notion of, you know, acting before it's too late, but actually this is not before, it's because. And of course, you know, to some extent, this is very much true. You know, a lot of the discussions now, including at COP on climate change mitigation, also talk about adaptation, right? How do we adapt and also potentially compensate countries for change, from the harmful effects that have already happened? However, as I will talk about in this talk, these forms of communication partly and to a large extent undermine some of the key drivers of the behaviour change that we're going to need to see. So we always talk about in the behavioural science team a very simple model of behaviour that summarises behaviour change as being due to three kind of key ingredients. One is capability. Do I know what to do? Do I have the skills to do it? Opportunity. Do I have the option to do it? You know, are there any financial barriers in the way of me adopting a technology? Are there any other practical barriers in the way of me doing it? And motivation. Do I want to do it? And the thing is that capability can actually create motivation. So the belief that we can do something and that what we do will be successful in, say, mitigating climate change plays a big role in how much we will want to do it. I mean, nobody wants to spend weeks of their life sorting through their recycling if they don't think it's actually going to make any difference, or nobody wants to invest in an electric vehicle if they don't think it's actually going to help cut emissions. And then a big part of not only driving our motivation is also the belief that actually I'm somebody that actually cares about the environment and wants to do something about it. So I'm going to talk about why we need to create a green self-identity, why we need to build people's self-belief, the belief that what they do, that they can achieve the things that are right for the environment, and then behavioural spillovers. So some of you might be familiar with this already, but there are two kind of key theories of self-identity. The first theory is that, you know, you're kind of almost born with this inner sense of being environmentally conscious. And as a result, you decide, you know, you'll do environmentally friendly things, like you will cycle rather than drive to work. But another theory, it's not really a rival theory, it's just to say that the identity can be built in two ways. And that one says that it actually can work the complete opposite way around. So that actually by observing what we do, that actually informs our sense of self and who we are. So you might notice, oh, I've been cycling instead of driving to work a lot recently. I must be an environmentally conscious person. And that kind of comes about because we've, as a society, labelled cycling as a pro-environmental behaviour. And just to give an example, what you might have is somebody who drives regularly to work, and then they decide, you know what, I'm gonna buy a bike, because rather than filling my car with petrol, which costs me lots of money, I'll cycle in because it'll be cheaper. And what they find is when they kind of get to work and they take off their bike helmet and sit at their desk, that one of their colleagues comments to them, gosh, that's really environmentally friendly of you to cycle all this way into work. To which they sort of reply and go, oh no, actually, I'm not really doing it for environmental reasons. I really was just bought the bike to save money on my commuting costs. But over time, more and more people say this to them. So they turn up at work and they say it, and their colleagues go, oh gosh, that's really environmentally friendly of you to cycle in. And then they start to think, well, actually, I don't know why I'm bothering telling people I only bought this bike to save money when I could instead claim the credit of being an environmentally and ethical person. And actually what can happen here is that people can start to reinterpret their past behavior as having been driven for a different motive through the feedback and the labeling that they get from other people. So what happens is that they get a sort of change in their self-identity. She starts to see herself as a person who cares about mitigating climate change, and a change in her self-belief. So she's decided she's going to cycle into work, and she does. And she goes, oh, look, that was something I could do, and I've been doing it for weeks or months. If I set my mind to something, I can achieve it. And those are two big factors that drive your motivation. So what happens next? You might say, well, so what? She cycles into work. I mean, that's not going to save the planet, not on its own anyway. But there's a theory called behavioural spillovers, which is that, you know, doing one behaviour can lead you to do another behaviour. So cycling to work instead of driving can result, given that she now has a sort of sense of herself as an environmentally conscious person, she might start to think, well, what else can I do for the environment? How else can I help? Or how else can I kind of show other people what I'm doing for the environment? So she might start looking into other methods and say, well, maybe I can start lowering the thermostat on my heating. Of course, it's not always good news. There are also such a thing as negative spillovers. So she might decide, well, maybe I'll buy an electric car so that, you know, maybe in the winter it's not very nice to cycle. I'll buy an electric car, and she might end up driving more, knowing or believing that, you know, because the electric car is better for the environment, it's not as bad as it was driving her old petrol car. And that's often known as rebound effects or moral licensing. And you see it a lot, or you hear about it a lot in the health sector, right? Where people might do some exercise and then you come home and think, oh, I've been really good and virtuous, so I'll order a takeaway and pudding. So you have to try, and when you're trying to take advantage of the behavioural spillovers, try to mitigate these moral licensing effects. So then the question would be, I've sort of given you an example of how it works in theory, but how might it work at a population level to foster pro-environmental behaviour change? So I sort of came up with this analogy, right, that if you imagine the journey to net zero is like climbing a mountain where the peak of the mountain is net zero. And there's loads of articles. I've referenced one here from Ivanova et al. From last year, where she had ranked, and her colleagues had ranked what behaviours were most impactful in terms of the ones that would get you the biggest bang for your carbon buck if you did them as an individual. So one of them, or the best one, was living car free. The next was sort of buying a battery electric vehicle, producing your own renewables, improving the energy efficiency of your home, going vegan, replacing a gas boiler with renewable heating. And those are the ones that featured on that list. All these sort of, you know, fairly, I guess, costly behaviours, high effort, but high reward. There's also other behaviours that weren't mentioned in that paper that are slightly easier, but might not reduce carbon emissions as much. So things like turning down the thermostat by a small amount, mending clothes rather than just keeping on buying new, and recycling. And what you can imagine is that, you know, everyone is at a different point in the journey. So most people are at the bottom of the mountain, right? They've not reached those middle bits yet. And some people might already have got to the point where they actually have replaced their heating. Other people might have already invested in insulation, and others might have already bought an electric vehicle. And the sort of challenge for communicators is, how do we communicate to all these people, encouraging them to do things that are important for meeting our climate targets, whilst acknowledging that everyone's starting from a different starting point. But also the point being that you can't climb the mountain, you can't reach the top of the mountain without starting from the bottom. Everyone's got to start from the bottom. It's just that some people are already higher up. Which is why, of course, these kind of articles about, how useful is recycling, whilst obviously incredibly well-intentioned, right? People writing these articles are trying to get to the bottom of, well, look, if you're really motivated to help the environment, what would be most effective? However, I think what the kind of literature on self-identity shows us and on behavioural spillovers is that this sort of thing can backfire. Because what it can do is for those and the majority who are really at the bottom of that mountain, who really are only at the point of recycling, who over many, many years have been recycling, have been told by governments and charities to recycle, and that's important. They might think, well, I can't afford an electric vehicle. I don't want to be vegan. I don't own my house, so I can't invest in energy efficiency. So being green just isn't for me, it's for other people. And the other people are the much smaller group of people that have already made it slightly further up the mountain. Generally, people who have a bit more money, a bit more time. And of course, if you think about the loss of trust that people might have, if you tell them that behaviors that you've encouraged them to do, like recycling, turning off lights when you're not in the room, that if you start to tell them now they don't work, why would they have faith in the newer behaviors that we're now encouraging people to do? So this sort of leads me on to, what principles can we use to foster a green identity and self-belief amongst the public? And I've sort of come up with a sort of an approach that could be taken. So the first is to communicate a public roadmap for going green. So, what's the plan? How are we going to get from our current lifestyles to a net zero lifestyle, and acknowledging that people might be at different stages in this roadmap and that that's absolutely fine. Then to identify what behaviours have the fewest behavioural barriers to action, and I'll come to that in a minute. And we want to sort of look really at the behaviours that have no major opportunity barriers, so big, financial outlays or huge amounts of hassle or time to install. Label those easy behaviours as green and explain why they're effective. So don't undermine your cause by saying recycling isn't effective. I mean, recycling might not be as effective as electric vehicles, but it plays a role. And we want to include the behaviours that most people are already engaged in, so that they can start to see themselves and identify themselves as people who are green and care about the environment. So like I was saying with recycling, if most people are already doing this, it seems a bit counterproductive, right? You'd think you'd want to focus on promoting the behaviours that most people aren't already doing, or that they don't think are important. But actually what this suggests is that what you should do is focus on the behaviours that most people are already doing, so they can interpret themselves as a green person. And then finally, what you want to do is ramp it up by labeling the next set of easiest behaviors as green, because what you don't want is that moral licensing effect where people go, oh, well, I've recycled, I'm, turning the lights off, I'm done, I've saved the planet. And what you want to do with that is make sure that you link back to the roadmap and remind people of their green identity. So link back to the plan, say, these are all the stages and behaviors we need people to do to get to net zero. This is where you started, and this is where we need to move on to. So I'm just going to give an example of what it means to do a behavioural barrier analysis. So I'm taking a couple of behaviours here that sort of range in how hard they are to do. So mending clothes, cycling to work, swapping over to low carbon heating. So what you might find with mending clothes is that you have a capability barrier, right? I don't know how to sew. So that might be a barrier in the way of someone mending their clothes rather than going out and buying new. An opportunity barrier might be, I don't have the time to do this. I maybe work several jobs. I'm looking after kids. I don't have the time. And there might be a motivation barrier, like I don't really believe that mending clothes makes any difference. Given look at all the pollution that businesses cause, right? Cycling to work might be you don't know what cycling routes there are to work. An opportunity barrier might be, well, I live much too far from work and I'm not cycling 2 hours to work every day. And your motivation barrier might be, well, I really like reading on my commute to work, so I don't really want to cycle. When it comes to low carbon heating, it might be you just never heard of any of the low carbon heating options. You know what a gas boiler is, but you've never come across a heat pump. You've certainly not come across hydrogen boilers. So how would you know to replace your gas boiler with a technology you've never heard of? Opportunity barrier, much, much bigger here, right? So what you can see is that the scale of opportunity barriers increases over these three behaviours. So much bigger. I can't afford a heat pump. Hydrogen boilers aren't, for sale commercially, and I live in a flat and that isn't suitable for a heat pump, or at least not without encouraging all other people that live in your block to maybe go down that same route. And you might be nervous about installing something that you've never used. And essentially what you should find is that over time, those opportunity barriers should decrease for those behaviours, right? So as there's more investment in cycling infrastructure, then those opportunity barriers for cycling should decrease. And as there's more investment in R&D for, say, hydrogen boilers and in heat pumps, the prices should come down. That then means that those opportunity barriers are much less. But for the moment, you can see why mending clothes or cycling to work is a much easier behaviour, or a behaviour that has fewer barriers than swapping to low carbon heating. So then you can say, well, how do I map these behaviours to an audience? And what you can see is that, for men, there'll be behaviours that are easy for everyone, in the sense that there's very few practical barriers in the way of people doing them. Maybe you have to run some sewing classes or expose people to videos showing them how to do basic stitching. But in general, these are easy for everyone behaviours. Behaviours that are easy for some, and then behaviours that are easy for a few, but only with some support. And those are your kind of early adopters. So that then helps you to go, well, who do I communicate these things to? So your easy for everyone behaviours, you communicate to the public at large. Easy for some, you communicate to those for whom it's easy, so people living in regions with good cycling infrastructure. And for low carbon heating, it might be people whose homes are suitable for heat pumps. And, you see a sort of increasingly tailored set of communications. And it's the first two, the easy for everyone and easy for some, that are the candidates for building this sort of self-belief and green identity, because there's fewer barriers. So it's much more possible for people to try it out, feel a sense of accomplishment. If you label the behaviours as green, they start to build that sense that, look, this is something I can do and something that I'm committed to. And this is something that's being put into practice already, with the One Step Greener campaign being run by the Cabinet Office and BEIS. So this is a campaign that was being run ahead of COP. And these are some of the images from that campaign, some of the TikTok videos that were set up. Sorry, the resolution isn't brilliant here, but I can just sort of briefly describe that. The image on the left-hand side talks about how people can be more green in the garden. So, using peat-free compost, things like that. Things that, if you have a garden, most people can do. Most people can, in theory, go to a garden centre and buy compost that's peat-free. And then also on the right-hand side, talking about vegan recipes that are alternatives to meat options, which again gives people ideas about how they can cook in a way that is more environmentally friendly. And it's showing, it's sort of to be an accessible way of being green, right? It's not suggesting that, the only way to be green is to buy an electric vehicle. So just to recap before I come to a close, sort of key principles for doing this would be, first of all, we need to build a green public identity. So I'm a green person who wants to mitigate climate change. Build self-belief. I'm capable of mitigating climate change, and when I take these actions, they do make a difference. So that means not having loads of articles undermining the efficacy of behaviours like recycling and behaviours like switching off your lights, just because those are the behaviours that most people are the only ones that most people are going to be able to do, for at least for a while, until certain technologies become cheaper. Anticipate and mitigate moral licensing and rebound effects. So by communicating what's the overarching plan and ramping up. So making sure people know that once they've done those behaviours, there's a next set that we need them to do. Provide targeted communications to support those who can already adopt low carbon technologies. So this is not about saying we shouldn't be promoting electric vehicles or we shouldn't be promoting heat pumps. It's just about saying we should be promoting those technologies in a tailored way to those that can take advantage of those things, so that we don't alienate those who can't, so that we don't appear to be elitist, which I think is a big problem associated with climate change mitigation. And then adapt our communications to changes in opportunity barriers. So as the cost of low carbon technologies declines, as new technologies enter the market, we can start to promote those behaviours to people who traditionally are lower down that mountain on the journey to net zero. So that concludes my talk. I'm going to leave my email address on screen in case anyone does want to get in touch afterwards, but very pleased to take any questions now too.
Moira, thank you very much. And this gives us a very good start for a discussion on what you've